When the date reached February 13, 1258, the soft, familiar sound of water flowing through the palace fountains vanished across the Abbasid court that had known 36 years of Caliph Al-Musta's rule. The sudden stillness of those ornate fountains, once the heartbeat of the gilded halls, was the first quiet warning that disaster was closing in. In Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, where scholars crossed deserts and seas to reach the greatest storehouse of human knowledge ever gathered, and where the air itself felt alive with water carried through ingenious canals, the drying of the fountains carried a dark meaning. That unnatural silence became the only truth echoing through the corridors of power. With every passing moment, the end moved closer. Beyond the towering palace walls, the horizon had been swallowed by the Mongol army, a force the world had never faced. Hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened warriors, emerging from the brutal emptiness of the Central Asian steppe, encircled the city like an endless ocean of men and horses. They did not understand the value of urban civilization, the beauty of philosophical debate, or the sanctity of written knowledge. They recognized only one language, the ruthless grammar of total conquest. Their reputation traveled ahead of them like a moving shadow. Only days remained before a civilization that had stood proud for 8 centuries would be ripped from history's stage. Yet the events that would truly shock the world were not limited to Baghdad's fall. The real horror, the acts that would scar humanity's memory, would begin only after the gates were finally broken. What awaited the Caliph, his wife, and his sons and daughters would leave a permanent stain on the record of human cruelty. The Mongols' goal went far beyond victory or territory. They intended to obliterate, to create an example so terrifying that its memory would serve as psychological warfare for generations. Their brutality was so extreme, so deliberately engineered, that even Persian court historians who witnessed it struggled, or refused, to write the whole truth. The reality was simply too heavy for words, until now. Now we are prying open the sealed chambers of history, examining the truths time tried to hide. We have desperate letters written by Venetian merchants who barely escaped. We have surviving fragments of Mongol military records, and dusty Persian manuscripts written in trembling script by those who saw what should never have been seen. Each document reflects only pieces of truth, like shards of a shattered mirror. And now we begin fitting those shards together, forcing forgotten horrors into the hard light of scrutiny. So let us return, in the mind, to Baghdad's final days of normal life, before everything changed. The gates are waiting to be broken, and what happens in the next 7 days will reshape the fate of the Islamic world for centuries. To understand the scale of what is coming, you must first understand the man at the center of it. Al-Musta'zim was no ordinary official. He was the Caliph. For millions, the shadow of God on earth, the successor of the Prophet Muhammad, the supreme figure of an empire that once stretched from the sunlit coasts of Spain to the spice-rich shores of India. He was the 37th ruler in the Abbasid line, an unbroken succession that had endured for 800 years, a rare achievement in human history. But like many great dynasties before it, the Abbasid line had aged. Its strength had thinned. The confidence that once fueled conquest and innovation had hardened into arrogance and complacency. Al-Musta'zim embodied that decline. History remembers him as weak-willed, more at ease with palace luxury than the harsh demands of rule. He surrounded himself with courtiers and advisors who told him what he wanted to hear, filtering out inconvenient truths about a world that was changing beyond his walls. Living in ceremony and comfort, he convinced himself that sacred titles and tradition would shield him from any threat. Even as Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon, and refugees arrived with stories of cities ruined to the east, he held tightly to fatal illusions. Even when the Mongol horde stood at Baghdad's gates, he repeated the same errors that had shaped his reign. In his mind, the world's order was fixed. He truly believed the Mongols would recognize his authority and submit to heaven's will. He did not doubt that divine protection surrounded him. However savage these invaders might be, he could not imagine anyone daring to violate his sacred position as Caliph, the spiritual and political leader of Islam. In his worldview, Baghdad itself was too holy, too central to creation's order to fall. It was the living archive of 8 centuries of scholarship, art, science, and culture, the beating heart of civilization. How could it collapse? But Al-Mustasim misunderstood the force facing him. Outside the walls stood Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, not merely a commander, but the leader of something closer to a natural catastrophe. The Mongol army had become an unstoppable machine that erased everything in its path. Crossing the Iranian plateau, they had wiped more than 40 cities from the map, leaving only ruins and mass graves. They had destroyed armies 10 times their size through superior tactics, discipline, and a ruthlessness beyond comprehension. Wherever they passed, rivers were said to run red, and grotesque warning monuments were raised to crush the will of all who looked upon them. Now the wealthiest and most culturally significant city in the known world lay exposed. Hulagu sent Al-Mustasim a message, recorded by the Persian historian Atta Malik Juvani. Simple, direct, and merciless. Surrender immediately and open the gates, and your life will be spared with some dignity intact. Resist, and your fate is sealed. The city will be reduced to dust, palaces burned to ash. Your family will face unimaginable consequences, and your name will be erased. Al-Mustasim answered with dismissive laughter. He summoned his advisers, contempt in his voice, and declared that these barbarians did not understand whom they threatened. He was the Caliph, the Prophet's successor, and God would never abandon him. They would learn their place. But fate, or God, had other plans. When the Mongol assault began on January 29, 1258, it was no ordinary siege. The Mongols brought overwhelming numbers and advanced siege technology the defenders had never faced. Chinese engineers captured in earlier campaigns, forced into service, brought early gunpowder weapons and devastating devices at the frontier of military innovation. Baghdad's ancient walls were hammered day and night. The earth shook under the impacts. Towers that had stood for generations collapsed one after another. The defenders' courage, however real, could not stop an enemy that had perfected warfare and turned killing into a method. Baghdad bled as its defenses crumbled piece by piece. On February 5, the outer walls were breached. By the 10th day, organized resistance had collapsed. And on February 13, Hulagu Khan entered the Abbasid throne room, the sacred space from which caliphs had ruled for centuries. The man who believed himself untouchable now knelt in dust, his golden robes torn and stained, reduced to a frightened, defeated figure. Al-Mustasim tried to plead for mercy, his voice breaking. Hulagu regarded him with cold curiosity, like a hunter studying trapped prey. Chroniclers such as Rashid al-Din preserved the moment. Hulagu asked where his God was now. Where was the divine protection he had trusted? The caliph's lips moved, but no sound came. Was he praying silently, or was fear locking his voice? No witness could say. Hulagu laughed without warmth and mocked him. Since you loved gold and treasure more than your people and your city's defense, let us see if gold can keep you alive. Then came a scene of calculated humiliation. The treasury, wealth gathered across centuries, was piled before Al-Mustasim. Gold coins, silver, jewels, relics. And in a deliberate act of symbolic cruelty, the Mongols forced him to consume what he valued most, prolonging the torment and refusing to let him escape through unconsciousness or death. But this was only the beginning. Hulagu ordered the royal family brought forward. Al-Mustasim had 3 sons and 4 daughters. First came his eldest daughter, Princess Fatima, 27 years old, renowned for learning, fluent in multiple languages, educated in philosophy and theology, celebrated for poetry, admired beyond her homeland, raised to believe knowledge could elevate the world. She was now driven to her knees before her helpless father. Mongol custom defined how captured nobility would be handled. But this was not mercy. It was humiliation designed to break bodies and spirits alike. What happened next became one of those moments so horrifying that chroniclers struggled even to hint at it. Accounts written later only gesture toward the outcome. It was witnessed by her father, and when it ended, she did not survive. The point was not only her death, but the destruction of everything she represented: culture, refinement, learning, crushed by men who treated those qualities as weaknesses to be exploited and erased. And the night's horrors did not end there. After her fate, Hulagu summoned the Caliph's sons: Prince Mubarak, 23, Prince Ahmed, 21, and Prince Ali, 14. Young men, one still a boy. Watching the final collapse of an 8th century dynasty, Hulagu looked at them with detached calm and repeated the same question. Where was their God now? And where was the protection promised to the house of Abbas? For a moment, the scene felt unreal, like a nightmare. Only yesterday they were heirs to an empire. Today they stood in chains before their executioner. Prince Mubarak stepped forward and said justice would come, that God would punish these crimes, even if delayed. Hulagu nodded slowly, almost as if acknowledging a correct answer, and then gave quiet orders. According to Mongol belief, spilling noble blood onto the earth brought curses. So they used methods meant to avoid visible blood. Large carpets were brought in. The princes were wrapped tightly, bound until movement was impossible, and killed through the heavy fabric. Their cries were muffled. No blood stained the ground. When the carpets were unrolled, the future of the dynasty was gone. Al-Mustasim watched. His daughter destroyed, his sons executed. And still the Mongols did not grant him a swift end. Hulagu wanted the final act to match the symbolic weight of what he was destroying. The Caliph was wrapped in carpets like his sons, but his end was staged differently. A wooden platform was built above him. Then Hulagu and his generals placed a victory feast on top and ate and drank while the man beneath slowly suffocated in darkness, unable to move or cry out. Their laughter and celebration pressed down with every shift of weight, every step, every cup raised, while the last Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad drew his final struggling breaths. By dawn, when the celebration ended, the carpet was unrolled. No blade had cut him. No blood marked the floor. Only the unmistakable signs of suffocation remained. Thus, within a single week, the Abbasid dynasty's 800-year rule in Baghdad came to an end. But the terror did not stay inside the palace. Baghdad was now defenseless. Its gates open, its forces shattered. The Mongol army moved through the city like wildfire. The killing continued for days without pause. Scholars and merchants, women and children, worshippers and beggars. No category offered safety. Entire neighborhoods were cleared in hours. The streets became so clogged with bodies that horses could not pass. Contemporary estimates speak of nearly 1 million dead, perhaps more. A city that once gathered the brightest minds on earth became an endless grave. And then came a loss that would echo for centuries: the destruction of Baghdad's libraries and the House of Wisdom. Nowhere else in the medieval world held such a collection of manuscripts, scientific works, philosophy, literature, the accumulated knowledge of Greek, Persian, Indian, Chinese, and Islamic civilizations, gathered, translated, preserved, and expanded across generations. In days, that inheritance was deliberately destroyed. Some texts were burned in fires that raged for days. Others were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that multiple accounts say the water changed color. First dark with ink, then red as the slaughter continued. A scholar named Ibn al-Fuwati survived by hiding in a well for 3 days without food or water, listening to the screams above. When he emerged, weak and shaking, he saw a city that no longer existed. In fragments of his account, he described streets carpeted with the dead, air so thick with the smell of death that breathing felt difficult, wild dogs feeding freely, the constant buzzing of flies, and distant cries of survivors and the dying. Imagine walking through your own city and finding it turned into a landscape of death. Imagine a civilization losing not only its people, but its memory, its art, its dreams, its books, its accumulated wisdom. Erased in days. The Mongol Empire would later build administrations and even patronize culture. But they could never conquer memory. Baghdad fell. Its people were scattered or killed. Yet the story of what happened to the Caliph's family endured, passed down in whispers, preserved in fragments, carried across generations until those whispers reached us. We tell these stories not to reopen wounds or ignite hatred, but because some truths are too terrible to be allowed to fade into comfortable forgetting. If we let them vanish, history has a habit of repeating its darkest chapters. Historians often describe Baghdad's fall in numbers: 1 million dead, a burned library, a destroyed city. But numbers do not suffer. Numbers do not plead. Numbers do not know what it means to hope, to fear, to love. That is why we must pause and try to understand what those 7 days truly meant. The end of a civilization is not a single collapse. It is a chain of irreversible failures, each one making the next inevitable. After the Caliph died beneath the platform, after the symbolic heart of the Islamic world was crushed, the killing became easier and more routine. With no sacred authority left as a barrier, Baghdad became only a conquered territory to be subdued. The Mongols moved street by street, house by house. Those who hid were pulled out. Those who fled were hunted. Those who sought refuge in mosques were killed where they prayed. Survivors said the streets ran with so much blood the ground turned to mud. Within days, the heat brought the stench of decay. And those who carried knowledge, doctors, astronomers, mathematicians, philosophers, became particular targets. Knowledge is power, and the Mongol objective was not merely to rule, but to break the city so completely that resistance would become unthinkable. The House of Wisdom burned for days, flames visible for miles. Priceless Greek texts translated into Arabic, Persian poetry, Indian mathematics, Islamic theology, destroyed by men who neither read nor wrote. Legends say the Tigris became so clogged with books that a rider could cross without wetting a horse's legs. The conquerors even joked about ink-stained water, treating learning as something to mock. By the end of the 7th day, Baghdad was no longer a living city. The walls still stood, but life was extinguished. Markets were silent. Canals were filled with corpses. For the first time in centuries, the capital fell quiet. No call to prayer, no pages turning, no debates in courtyards, no poetry in gardens. The Mongols did not stay to rebuild. They burned, destroyed, delivered their message of absolute power, and continued west. Baghdad became a warning marker, an example meant to terrify all who heard of it. And it worked. Other rulers, learning what happened to Baghdad and its caliph, surrendered rather than risk the same fate. Even as the Mongols marched towards Syria and Egypt, the story traveled faster than armies. People spoke in hushed tones about the palace scene, the crushed caliph, the eradicated dynasty. A chilling realization spread. If it could happen to Baghdad, the greatest city in the Islamic world, then nowhere was truly safe. This changed Middle Eastern history. The Islamic Golden Age did not end in one night, but its center shifted permanently. Learning and power moved elsewhere. Cairo, Damascus, Samarkand. The world kept turning, but with a visible scar. Islamic states grew more defensive. Walls thickened. Libraries were hidden or fortified. Openness gave way to caution. Survivors scattered across the world carrying trauma with them. In cities and villages, stories were passed down, sometimes softened for children, but never forgotten. The Mongols could burn buildings and books, but they could not erase oral memory. Over time, the Mongol Empire fragmented. Rival Khans fought. The unified empire split into competing khanates, then was absorbed by other cultures. Yet Baghdad remained a lasting symbol, proof that even the mightiest civilizations, when they ignore new dangers and trust old glory over present reality, can collapse with shocking speed. Al-Mustazim believed titles would protect him. He relied on divine favor while neglecting practical defense. His faith in an unchanging world became fatal blindness. If this story teaches anything, it is this: no civilization, no matter how wealthy, knowledgeable, or culturally advanced, is immune to destruction. Power and glory are not permanent, they are conditions that must be maintained. The moment a society believes it is invincible is often the moment it becomes most vulnerable. Now pause and think back to the silent fountains. The first warning was not an alarm or an explosion, but the quiet disappearance of a familiar sound. Disasters often begin like that, on ordinary days, until suddenly everything you believed was permanent is gone. You have witnessed one of humanity's darkest weeks. If this story has shown how cruel people can be, and how fragile even civilization's greatest achievements are, then do not let this truth be buried again. Do not allow the lesson to fade. Subscribe to Vox History and help keep these difficult but necessary chapters alive and accessible. Because when we forget, history does not stay safely locked in the past. It finds a way to return in new forms. The fall of Baghdad remains an eternal warning. Vigilance, wisdom, and the courage to face hard truths are the only real defenses against the darkness humans are capable of creating.